We are back in a bid to curb and police increasing wildlife poaching. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in collaboration with NAMPOL as well as the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, will present a wildlife crime scene investigation course to Namibian law enforcement officers. Here with more information is the Law Enforcement Attaché for Southern Africa in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ed Newcomer. Good morning, Mr. Newcomer, and welcome to Good Morning Namibia.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Are you a newcomer to Namibia too, or just to the show?
I've been to Namibia several times, but the surname newcomer serves me well.
Great. Let's talk about the background on the mandate and activities of your esteemed office, please.
So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we are a national police agency in the U.S., and we have federal agents that enforce wildlife laws there. As wildlife trafficking has become more of a problem, we have stationed 7 of our special agents overseas to serve in our U.S. embassies as wildlife law enforcement attachés, and I'm the one that covers Southern Africa.
We're mindful of the surge in wildlife poaching, but could you elaborate on what specifically necessitated the establishment of an office in Southern Africa?
Well, as I said, we have 7 agents now around the world. 3 of those are in Africa, 1 in East, 1 in West, and 1 in Southern. Wildlife trafficking is impacting every country in the world, and Southern Africa has been hit particularly hard. As Namibians know, rhinos and elephants have been poached heavily in unsustainable numbers. Lions are now under threat, and other animals such as pangolins that you wouldn't have expected to be threatened. So the U.S. recognizes that this is a global problem, and we want to try to be part of the solution in solving that problem. So we're putting our agents overseas.
Interestingly enough, in our parliament yesterday afternoon, the leader of the official opposition alleged that we have too many elephants, for example, and that's part of the challenge, that the numbers are too high. What do you make of such a view?
Well, Botswana has similar issues with large populations of elephants in certain parts of the country. But the interesting thing, if you look at it more from a regional perspective, the elephant populations in that area between Namibia, Angola, Botswana, and Zambia, and Zimbabwe, their natural behavior should be to migrate around that area as food sources are available and water sources are available. But because poaching in some of those countries has become so heavy, elephants are smart. They go to the countries where they're safest. And Namibia and Botswana pretty much have the best law enforcement programs going to protect their wildlife. There are still challenges in those countries, but the elephants know that they're safest in those countries. So these elephant populations that should be spread out are congregating now. So yes, that's going to increase human-wildlife conflict, but I'm not sure the answer is to cut down the elephant population, because if you do that, you're really impacting the regional elephant population.
What does the U.S. benefit from having such an office in Southern Africa, in Botswana particularly?
Well, I'm a regional position. It's just coincidence that it's positioned there in Botswana. But from the U.S. perspective, we benefit because international crime in general, whether it's wildlife or any other crime, destabilizes nations around the world, including the United States. So combating international crime is a priority for the U.S. In terms of wildlife crime, you know, Americans are jealous of Namibians. I mean, you have amazing wildlife here, wildlife we don't have. And so from a U.S. perspective, it benefits U.S. citizens to protect wildlife around the world or to help other countries protect it. Because we want to come here and spend our money to see your amazing wildlife in the wild. Just as we know that Namibians would love to come to the U.S. and see our grizzly bears and our buffalo and our wolves. So we protect those animals not just for our own citizens, but for everybody in the world.
From a law enforcement perspective, you need to involve governments too. How do you go about engaging the governments in Southern Africa on this very contentious issue?
It's an important reason to have an attaché based in Africa, because it gives you an opportunity to interact with your colleagues in other governments and other law enforcement agencies face to face. And we all know that face to face personal relationships are how you get things done. So the main way we go about it is we just, I've been here for almost 3 years, so we set as many meetings as possible. We interact with our colleagues in law enforcement agencies throughout the region, and we basically say, how can we help? And we find out what the needs are, and then we try to address those needs as best we can.
Reflecting on your 3 years in the region, which are the most pertinent challenges that you've been experiencing?
Well, I think you touched on it a little bit when you talked about the issue of are elephant populations too large, or what is the situation there? Human-wildlife conflict is certainly one of the largest issues, but there's also this issue of making sure that we're looking at the entire criminal enterprise. Just catching the poacher, the individual who is economically disadvantaged, who's taken advantage of by the larger syndicates, is not the answer to stopping poaching and trafficking. We have to address that because criminal activity is criminal activity, but we also have to look at the middle level traffickers as well as the big kingpins,
And a very important part of that process is wildlife crime scene investigations.
Absolutely.
And that's why you're here. Please talk to us about what that entails.
Yeah, well, a wildlife crime scene is really similar to a murder scene. I mean, you have all the same elements. You have a body, most of the time, or evidence that something was killed. And you have evidence at the scene that's going to help you link a suspect to the victim, which would be the animal in this case, and the scene. It's very, very important to process that scene properly so that you can collect all the evidence you need to eventually identify suspects, make arrests, and make prosecutions. But we all know that cases can fail if the basic law enforcement work at the very beginning is not done correctly.
So, in as much as it's very similar to a murder scene, what makes it different, and what are the particulars that you'll be training our law enforcement officers in during this workshop?
Right. So, a wildlife crime scene is unique, particularly in Africa, because you have so many elements that can interfere with the scene. The weather, you have predators and scavengers that can come in and destroy a scene, and the remote locations make processing a crime scene extremely difficult. If you're at a murder scene in a city, you can have as many officers and as much equipment as you need to get it done. But if you have an elephant or rhino poaching that occurs in the bush in a remote area, you have to get all your equipment and the people you need there. So you may find yourself processing a crime scene with just one or two officers and a handful of equipment. So that's a real challenge.
What are the ultimate objectives of the workshop? What would our officers be able to master upon completion of the workshop?
Namibian police understand, just like U.S. police do, that continual training is the key to maintaining good professional police forces. So what we're hoping is, by providing this training, we can build upon the training that the Namibian police and the Ministry of Environment have already had, and we can reaffirm with them the skills and techniques that are needed and appropriate at a good crime scene evaluation. So they should come out of this empowered, reassured that the training they've had before is correct and that what they're doing is right. And I'll tell you one great thing about getting law enforcement officers together for training is they exchange stories and they exchange experiences about what happened to them. Best practices, exactly.
Yeah. You earlier mentioned that the crime is quite multifaceted. There are many stakeholders involved, also as far as perpetrators are concerned. Do you plan to get some of the other stakeholders involved too, members of the public perhaps?
Absolutely. I've been a U.S. law enforcement officer for wildlife for 15 years. And one thing I've learned over the years is that it's fine to go catch bad guys. But unless the public is invested in protecting wildlife and understands why it's important, you're really not having an impact just by catching bad guys. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is committed to making sure that resources are there to educate the public about why these things are valuable and why it's important to Namibia, and not just Namibia, but the whole world, to have these wild animals there for us and our future generations.
What's your sense of the prospects of success of curbing wildlife poaching? Could we win this fight?
Absolutely. I'm completely optimistic. One is by looking at history. If you remember back your history in the late 1980s, people were predicting that elephants would be extinct by 2000 if poaching levels continued at the levels they were then. Steps were taken, elephant populations rebounded, and now, unfortunately, we're in a cycle again where poaching levels have picked up. We know most of the causes of that and the countries that are causing it, and it can be addressed. And I'm confident we will address it. And in collaboration between law enforcement, lawmakers, and the public, we can do it. It's just a collective effort. It's not an individual effort.
Before we say goodbye to you, your brief final remarks, please.
Well, I want to say that I'm extremely happy to be in Namibia. I enjoy working with the law enforcement authorities in Namibia, and I look forward to a continued strong relationship between the U.S. and Namibia.
And when you're back here, you won't be a newcomer anymore.
That's right. You can call me Ed Oldtimer next time.
Thank you very much. That was Mr. Ed Newcomer, law enforcement attaché for Southern Africa in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We'll be back with the news at 7. Do stay tuned.